You're listening to the Manifest Your Greatness podcast, and this is episode number 79. Hi, friends. I'm Curtis J. Washington. And look, the purpose of this podcast is simple. We are constantly being bombarded with messages like, we could be happy if only we had a particular thing, or we could be successful if only we made X amount of dollars, or we could be at peace if only so-and-so loved me. These messages are not only disempowering, but also they are simply not true. This is because it's not about where you are and where you want to be. It's about who you are right now and who you wish to become. Once you know what the ideal you looks like, then you will automatically start becoming aware of what steps you can take right now to move in the right direction. And the goal of this podcast is to help you look within and discover all the love, all of the beauty, and all of the unlimited potential that you already possess, and for you to set it free for you and for the world to see. Welcome to the Manifest Your Greatness podcast. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the Manifest Your Greatness podcast, where we explore practical and actionable steps that you can take to help you manifest the greatness that you already possess deep inside. And today's special guest is Michelle Steiner. And Michelle was diagnosed with a learning disability in kindergarten and told that she had to repeat kindergarten and receive specialty instruction. And in high school, she was told by her counselors that she couldn't handle college due to her disabilities. However, Michelle advocated for herself and successfully tested into community college, where she achieved her associate's degree in early childhood education. But when she expressed interest in going to college for her bachelor's degree, she was again told that would be too much for her. But instead of listening to the naysayers, Michelle pushed forward and defied odds and ultimately received her bachelor's degree. And she did not stop there. Michelle is now a writer, an advocate, and a paraeducator, and she has published articles on the Mighty, Nonverbal Learning Project, Dyscalculia blog, The Reluctant Spoonie, Imagine the World as One magazine, and Word Gathering. Recently, she also began a blog called Michelle's Mission, and Michelle's mission is to educate, empower, and encourage people with and without disabilities. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for joining the Manifest Your Greatness podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Curtis. I certainly appreciate it.
Well, it's great to have you here, and you have done so much, and I definitely want to get into all of the things that you have accomplished and all the ways that you are advocating for others and all the wonderful work that you're doing. But before we get started, I was just wondering if maybe we could take a step back and maybe you could walk us through when you were a child and you were growing up. If you could share with us when it was that you discovered that you had a learning disability.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I discovered I had a learning disability when I was in kindergarten. My kindergarten teacher noticed that certain things were hard for me, like counting and dot-to-dot pages, and I was just really frustrated, and I wanted to learn just like my peers did, but it just didn't seem to happen. And they recommended that I get tested for having a learning disability. And right after they found out I had one, my mom and dad explained to me as a young child that I had a learning disability and that I learned differently.
So, and how did, so once you had discovered that you had a learning disability and that you learned differently,
Mhm.
what happened from there? How did life change for you in the classroom and outside of the classroom?
Right. One of the biggest changes that happened is I had to repeat kindergarten the following year in a new school in our district. And it was still a public school, but it was just a different location. And I also began to receive specialty instruction that year as well. I began to receive it in all areas in the beginning. And it took me on, a journey where I was in classes that were separate from my peers for a while. And even when I was, thankfully, some of the supports began to work. I still, and I was in more regular ed classes, I still received things such as have accommodations, such as having a note taker, having, well, not a note taker. I had extended test time. The test read aloud to me. And the school I went to was very small.
Mm,
So I couldn't hide the fact I had a learning disability, and they weren't always the most accepting with my peers. So the bullying began when I was pretty young. So school was a real struggle for me socially and academically.
mm. Yeah, and so yeah, socially as well. I was wondering in terms of your, like you said, you were separated
Mhm.
from your peers for some time in some of the classes, and you had
Mhm.
extended time to take tests and things like that. Um, what kind of conversations or how did that impact socially? Did you have friends that were very understanding about how, the challenges that you had, or were they not able to relate, or kind of what was that like, that experience?
I had a really difficult time with relating to my peers. I felt when I was in learning support, most of my peers, they struggle more with reading and behavior issues. And that was really hard for me because I struggle with math. And some of them also had some pretty rough home lives.
Yeah.
So that was really difficult. And then when I was with my regular ed peers and some of the classes with reading or science, social studies, a lot of them didn't accept me as a peer that was smart. And they lumped me together with the peers that I went into learning support with. So I had a really hard time figuring out just where I was as a person as a young child. And I can remember when I was young, it was a lot more, okay, we don't want you to come and play with us on the playground, or you didn't get invited to a birthday party. But it got harder when I was a teenager because a lot of the groups became more defined. And I
Yeah.
just looked at them and I thought, I really don't belong with any of them. And it was also really hard because it became where, well, you can't sit with us at lunch, and just a lot more of the exclusion, a lot of the bullying got worse. So one of the things that I did that really helped was there was a art program in a neighboring school district, and I started to get involved with them.
Mm.
And I was able to shed that reputation that I had of all those years as the student that was the outcast. And I found acceptance, and that encouraged me to reach out to some other groups in the community. And there's a writing group that I'm still involved with over 20 some years later, and still have some of those friendships.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned some things about the whole in the classroom. There were
Mhm.
some classes that you were with your peers, and then
Mhm.
other classes where you were receiving some specialty instruction.
Right.
And then other times, if I understood this correctly, it seemed like there were times where you were treat it as if you need specialty instruction for things that you were actually doing fine at because you were diagnosed with having a learning disability. Is that accurate?
Right. Right. What they would do is there were certain things figured out what I could do a lot of. They
Mm.
figured out I was pretty good at reading. I just struggled with reading comprehension, but I was a fluent reader from the time I was very young. We knew I could read really well, and they knew I could write. So that opened up the door to me to be in a lot more regular ed classes, such as science and social studies and things like that. And eventually those I was in all regular ed classes except for the math and the resource. Those and resource was just catching me up on my work and helping to give support in those other classes, which I was doing well in. But math, we never were able to be successfully transitioned into a regular ed math class. It just never worked out. And I got the support that I needed, though, because that was always one of the big areas that I struggled with.
Right, right. And in this, I'm really curious about if things have changed since you were in elementary school and high
Mhm.
school. But when you hear someone has a learning disability, like you were saying, you were diagnosed with a
Mhm.
learning disability, but it
Right.
sounds like there are so many variations of what that could mean that it almost sounds like a blanket, kind of thrown, and it's like, okay, well, this is the way it is. And it's like, well, but do you really understand who I am and what exactly I'm struggling with? Or are you just assuming I'm going to struggle, period, and have to be treated differently? What was your experience, and do you believe things have changed since then?
Well, my experience was whenever I was in school, it was more of a blanket term when they said you had a learning disability. Um, they didn't I didn't have a specific one until I was diagnosed into an adult. But we all knew I wasn't going to be a mathematician. That's definitely was in the cards. But a lot of people thought I was lucky. I had a lot of great teachers, but I also had some teachers that that didn't think that I could do a lot with having that. Sometimes we had a lot of issues like with regular ed teachers thinking what I could do or what I was capable of. And there was a lot that they saw the potential in what I could do and were able to nurture that as well. When I look at students today, we do have more specific learning disabilities that are diagnosed. A lot of them will have specific learning disabilities because there's a wide range of them. It's not just people that struggle with reading and have something such as dyslexia. There's ones that can affect a lot of different areas, and everybody experiences it differently too. I think there's always changes whenever you deal with students that have disabilities. It's definitely something now where we see a lot more students that are more into regular ed classes, and there's not as much specific instruction
Mhm.
that I had whenever I was older, when I was younger. So
Mhm.
we don't have a lot of that. But I honestly think too, now we're a little more aware of what they are. And I get that opportunity at the school that I work with to be able to help students that have disabilities. And sometimes it's like hearing a recording of myself at that age. I hate my learning disability and I hate the individual education plan. And I get that opportunity to tell them it's okay to have a disability. It's not a bad thing you have a plan. This is what your plan is here for. And whenever I was growing up, I had a lot of support, but I really never had somebody that had a disability to walk alongside me and say, it's all right to have this and everything is going to work out.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned that just kind of made me think a little bit in terms of kind of identifying what kind of learning disability someone might have, is this whole, idea of standardized testing and things. And,
Right.
some people excel at certain subjects, some don't. And we really still, even for people who are not diagnosed with a learning disability, it seems like there's really not much of an understanding or a consideration given to, like you were saying, you knew when you were young, you weren't going to be a mathematician. Well, I knew that too. There was no way. So I was never, of course, I was never diagnosed with having a learning disability, but I
Mhm.
always kind of wondered why, some of my peers were able to, study an hour what took me 6 hours to learn, for example. And
Mhm.
it's just, it really kind of makes me wonder, how it makes me think that there's so much more studying that needs to happen in this whole space of learning disabilities in general. And we haven't really explored it. And it seems like, at least to the level where so much more could be understood in terms of why certain individuals are struggling with certain activities or learning certain skills, and
Mhm.
how we can help them without that feeling of kind of being singled out, like you were saying, but give them the support that they need, or give them an approach that is more that they may be able to use and leverage more effectively than kind of the general approach, you know. And I always kind of wondered about that. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. Do you kind of feel that there is a lot that is kind of assumed and really not being explored at this point?
I think a lot of times what people assume is when they look at those test results, like I'm not a great test taker to begin with,
Yeah.
people automatically look at that and say, oh, you can't go to college or you can't do this. And
Mhm.
the problem is whenever we just look at the test results based on what they can't do, I think that is definitely an issue. And I do think that a lot of times we are not aware of a lot of things that do work for somebody that has a disability and what can happen. I think sometimes that's can sometimes I can remember when I went to school, it was just the work was on my level, but we had the same packets that came up, especially in high school, and we weren't doing anything differently, and I still couldn't understand it, and they were doing the same method. So I think sometimes when someone has a learning disability, it's not that they can't learn, it's just that sometimes they need effective methods to teaching that. And I think that we have to, as educators, or people who work with students, if we're doing something and it's not working for them, we have to keep on looking for a different way to be able to teach them, because otherwise, if we don't do that, then we really do fail the child.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And so when you finished high school, and of course there was, you know, there were the naysayers saying, you
Mhm.
know, maybe college
Yeah.
is something you don't want to try to deal with, and it would be too difficult. You know, definitely not encouraging words that anyone wants to
Mhm.
hear.
Right.
How did you, you know, I imagine through this process, you were starting to pick up on some techniques maybe that were helpful in some ways, or how did that process work for you?
Well, one of the things I did like about the program that I was in, it was based upon what I could do. My parents were always my greatest advocates.
That's great.
So I always knew that if I was going to go in anything math or science related, we were going to have it was going to be a real challenge for me, but I was starting to get really good grades in other subject areas.
Mhm.
So I can remember I knew that I knew it was going to be a challenge when I went to school. And I can remember that was definitely a factor.
Mhm.
And I had, for the teacher who told me that I couldn't do it and suggested a trade school, I knew going into that would not be the right thing for me, because it really would have been hard for some of the things that they were doing at the school. But I also was really blessed to have a student teacher, and she encouraged me. She knew students that had disabilities, and she told me, you can go to college. And I was like, I can go to college? And she said, yes, because you know how to study, and there's people that have disabilities that can go and to do that. And sometimes whenever I was at school and it was really hard, she would her voice is what I heard, um just encouraging me that I could do that. And I also got connected with an agency called Office for Vocational Rehabilitation, and they paid for the testing, for because in order to receive the funding, I had to get tested again for having a learning disability. And I can remember they also made sure I got had disability accommodations. And whenever I got tested, that my testing wasn't so great, and the psychiatrist told me, you're most likely not going to go beyond a community college.
Mhm.
And a lot of it wasn't necessarily that I couldn't do it, but I had to find the right program for me
Mhm.
and my way of how my brain is going to work. And that was the key thing. And using the accommodations, those are definitely things. Whenever I did those, I researched things, I found the right program, and I used the accommodations, my grades improved tremendously. And when I didn't use them, it was a real struggle for me.
And so you mentioned that also it took some time to kind of find the right program for you.
It
I was
did.
wondering, how did you decide on the program that was a good fit for you?
Well, one of the first things we discussed with when I was with OBR was I how I was going to go to college because I didn't have the advanced placement classes. I didn't take the SATs. So they suggested going to a community college for the first couple of years because a lot of times universities will look at, okay, how well you performed at a community college.
Mhm.
And I knew that I wanted to work with kids in some capacity. So I went for early childhood education. And it was difficult with being that first year out. I mean, those first couple years I think were hard. Maturity definitely was on my side. When I went back a few years later, I had the maturity, I had the associate's degree, I knew what I was a little more what I was doing. And it was just carefully researching. I found when I went to university, I found a program that had the least amount of math and science possible. And it was in a program that I loved. It was the service end of special education. And it was making that decision because a lot of people were saying, well, why don't you be an elementary school teacher? And that just was not going to be the right course of action for myself. I knew the testing requirements would be hard. I knew some of the classes just wouldn't be the most forgiving. So I thought, this is as close as I can get. And I knew people that their attitude toward people with disabilities changed dramatically after going through the program. And I was delighted to find when I got there, the reason why. It was just a wonder. The professors were wonderful, and just they had a caring heart, and it was the right fit for me. And but also in the classes that were outside of that department, I was able to manage them by using my support services on campus, with having a note taker, with having extended test time, and most importantly, advocating for myself. I went up to a professor, if it was a new one, at the beginning of every year, introduced myself and said, these are the services that I need. And most of them were very understanding and helpful and kind. You always got one or two that maybe didn't quite get it, but
Mm.
we were able to work with that. And when I used them, my grades improved. I made dean's list for a semester. And I,
Wow.
yeah, and I was doing well in my classes. And I was able to graduate with having debt free with my bachelor's degree, despite people saying I couldn't do it, because I found a program that worked for me and I found the support services that I needed to have.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That is fantastic. And you mentioned advocating for yourself, and
Mhm.
I find that this has come up on some other episodes that
Mhm.
I've had as well, and it's this is something that I think a lot of people struggle with because
Mhm.
it's just difficult for a lot of people to be forthcoming in what they need and to be forthcoming in looking at situations
Mhm.
as solvable and not feeling overwhelmed and not feeling in control of the situation and not feeling powerless. And I was
Mhm.
wondering, in terms of becoming a self advocate, that takes so much courage. Like, where did that come from?
Well, a lot of it's maturity. Because I remember there was a time, especially after I graduated from high school, started college, and I really cared a lot about what other people thought about me. And people would say, "Oh, you're getting an unfair advantage," or
Mm,
"This, you shouldn't be getting this," or "You're going to have, you know, this is going to be a crutch for you." And I really took that to heart. And when I didn't use it, it really was a detriment to me. But
right, right.
maturity, I really, I stopped caring as much about what people thought and started
Yeah.
moving forward to do what I thought was best for myself. I think that was a big thing. And it wasn't being ashamed of having the disability, and it wasn't running away and hiding from it. It was embracing uh, the parts about having a disability that you don't like, but also discovering that there's parts about it that are good and that are positives as well.
Yeah, I mean and that's so important. And like you said, you even ran into some teachers that didn't get it, when you were trying to explain,
Yeah.
hey, this is what I need. But just having the
Mhm.
courage, and also having that maturity and saying, hey, I know what I need, and
Yeah.
and to follow through and to continue to push forward. And then of course there was all of these naysayers and people. I mean, your
Mhm.
psychiatrist even said,
Yeah.
that's probably not going to happen.
Right.
I mean, when you hear these things, how do you process that and then move through that? Because I would imagine it's not easy, but here you are, in everything that you've done. So yeah,
Right. A lot of times the main thing is you have to take sometimes what the information they're giving you with a grain of salt.
yeah.
I mean, yes, there are certain things I can't do. I wish that when you did go in for testing that they focused a little more on what you could do, or at least be encouraging to find a way to be able to do it. I think it's just taking that information for what it is and finding a way around it to be able to do it. That's been the main thing. I like it where they, even as I went back as an adult to get testing for some other accommodations, they told me, well, you probably can't do things that involve writing or communications. And I was able to do it. I had to find a way, and for somebody to be able to give me a chance as well.
So with the naysayers and with the people who
Mhm.
were saying here's the limitations, it almost sounds like you were hearing that as, well, this is something I need to be aware of, but it's not impossible. Let me just, I hear what you're saying. Maybe I need to spend a little bit more time or effort, in working towards figuring out how to get through that. So it sounds like that might be a challenge. It sounds like you have a translation in your head going, when someone says can't, you're like, well, okay, that sounds like that may require extra work, or that may require some more resources, or that may require some more support. And it's just, yeah, I mean, is that kind of how that works? Or how did you kind of just turn around and just say, I hear you, but you're not stopping me?
I think it was doing it afraid, because
Yeah.
I can remember going into this and I was really concerned. And that sometimes I would get a bad grade on a test, or I'd hear somebody telling me, oh, this isn't going to work out for you. And I would be afraid going into class. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but I just kept on pushing ahead and going forward. And I was discouraged, but I just kept on going. And then when I found out, oh, okay, I can do this, then it became more, all right, I hear what you're saying. I know it's going to be difficult, but I can find a way to do this. We can find a way to make it work. And I think that was what I needed to. I think after I graduated with my bachelor's, that's when I started to realize, okay, yeah, some things like math and driving, they may not be possible in my life, but we're going to be able to find a way to make things work. And it just gave me that encouragement to help other people through that process too, to encourage them.
Yeah, yeah. And then, like you said, even with things that were perhaps too difficult
Mhm.
from a skill perspective, if you're talking about math at some level,
Yeah,
and driving, I remember you'd mentioned that before, that
yeah,
that's something that you're not able to do, but it's the reason it's considered useful rather than the
yeah.
end, right? So it's like, okay, well, if I can't figure out how to do some of these more complex math problems, how am I going to get help so that I can, get to where I need to go? Same thing with
Mhm.
driving, right? It's, okay, I can't drive, but what other options are there out there to get me where I need to go? So,
Yep.
yeah, it sounds like you're always thinking about, all right, what else is there, and what other opportunity or what other potential way is there to get what I want, knowing what I know? That's
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, exactly. Because there's always a way to do things. It just may
Yeah,
not look how I might have imagined it or how somebody else imagined it, but
yeah,
there's a way to do it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's so true, like what you were saying about how um, if people assume that there's only one way, or that if you can't do
Mhm.
something a certain way, then that's then things are going to be terrible. If people allow themselves to think that way, it can
Mhm.
really work against them. But you have kind of turned that on its head, and taking it as information, but not as a prognosis, or not as this is
Yeah.
where you're going to end up, because you can't do this. It's like, okay, no, this means this is not the way I need to travel in order to, get what I really want. So we'll find something else. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Yes, you got to find what works.
yeah. So you get your bachelor's degree,
Mhm.
and what happens next?
Well, it took me a while to find the right job. I worked at some places that weren't the most disability friendly. Um, but I am really blessed that I got a job working in a school now for about 12 years, working as a paraeducator in a school. And all the kids, they know, do not ask me for help with math. That's usually my disclaimer at the beginning of every school year, and I'll be doing it later on at the end of August. Um, but the staff I work with is wonderful. They understand, okay, maybe she can't do math, but we're able to do that. So you can help out with the reading, you can help out with the history, you can help out with a lot of other things. And I get that opportunity to sit down with them and to work with my students. Uh, I worked with seventh graders last year, so it was a lot more than just doing academics. A lot of times we did that advocacy skills. We did a lot of social skills. I can remember I had a lot of students that would come in really scared to ask a regular ed teacher for help, and they were struggling. And I had that opportunity to share with them how they advocate. And we don't have a student that's scared anymore. They know how to ask for help. And that's one of the best things I think about is right before school ends. I have a student that knows what they're doing. They'll start out in the beginning with a backpack full of papers that are everywhere, and I'll
Yeah.
gently go through and we'll organize them. And by the end of the school year, they're asking for folders and they're organizing their own papers. And I think that it's just that going in and getting that help for them is just so powerful, and just the way that I'm able to use that. Another thing that I started after my getting my bachelor's degree, it just started a few years ago. I began writing about having a learning disability. Writing has always been really healing for me. And I can remember I had a friend who told me, you really should write about having a learning disability. And I said, oh, I don't know about that. That's pretty personal. And I think I wrote some bad poetry and some other really cringeworthy stuff in my youth. And I can remember, though, when I got that first article published on the Mighty about my struggle with limited hand dexterity with opening up locks,
Mhm.
and I got that published, that was another really healing thing that I done.
Yeah.
And it just encouraged me to write more articles. And I started my own blog a few years ago too, called Michelle's Mission.
Mhm.
And I write about having a learning disability. And I also do a lot of nature photography because people say I can bring out details in a flower that other people can miss.
Mhm.
And I have found that I do sometimes pick up on details that other people do miss, because I'll be in the car with my husband and I'll say, did you see that? And he's like, no, I'm focused on the road. And I'll see a flower, or I'll see a sign for a restaurant, or just something new. And oftentimes, if it's close by, I have that chance to go back on a walk and take the picture of the flower that I saw.
Yeah.
And I get to post that. And people are always like, oh, wow, that's really neat that you were able to do that. And sometimes I'll incorporate some of my nature articles in with the pictures. And I also have a little store on there where we talk, where I have things that people can buy with prints and journals and books. And I also started a forum where people can connect with disability related topics.
Yeah.
And it's just trying to get people together and inform, educate, and empower people with and without disabilities.
Yeah, and there's so much information as well, and I'll be sure to include this in the summary for the podcast. But definitely, your website, michellesmission.net. I've
Uh-huh.
I've spent quite a bit of time there lately, and there's so much beauty in the way that you describe nature and how you relate it to the struggles that you've been through. And it's so relatable. I mean, it's
Mhm.
really, I think anyone who ever questioned where they fit in the world, reading your work is just like, oh, wow, I totally fit. I'm just not the same, you know?
Mhm.
So, I mean, there was some, I'm just going to read a little section of one of
Mhm.
your works. You had a blog post called The Bouquet of Neurodiversity.
Mhm.
And in there you said, even if a flower is the same type, it doesn't mean that it will be the same. There are variations in color, shape, and size. The same concept applies to people with disabilities. A person who shares the same diagnosis will experience the disability differently. People don't understand why I struggle with math when most associate learning disabilities with dyslexia and other reading based disabilities. And it's just, I mean, the whole idea of this bouquet, right? And then, of course, I don't want to give it all away, but in your blog, it's beautifully explained how everybody is a bouquet. They have their own bouquet
Mhm.
and they're all going to be different. And to look at someone else's and wish you had theirs is kind of a waste of time. You got to focus on nourishing your bouquet because your flowers require specific things and you need to make sure that you're taking care of them. And I thought it was beautiful. And I think it also really touches on how approachable you are because of your sensitivity to these things. And just briefly, I wanted to kind of tie back in your work as a paraeducator and how, like you were saying, when you explain to the students, hey, don't come to me with math problems. There's other teachers for that, but reading, history, things like that, feel free to come to me. And just the idea of saying that is so disarming, I think, and it lets students know you are vulnerable. And for a
Mhm.
student looking at teachers in general, they see teachers typically as, well, it's easy for them. They know everything, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't want to go to them because they're going to tell me that I'm not studying hard enough. But then when you know someone who is a teacher who is admitting that they have difficulty with certain skills, it's just like, oh, this person I can talk to because they get it. They know what it's like to struggle. So I just thought that was such a great something I just wanted to make sure everybody heard is that vulnerability can open up so many doors to other and to helping others as well. And I just thought that was really worth just kind of repeating. But it's just amazing, and I would imagine you get that from your students as well, right? That, hey, I'm coming to you because I know we can talk and you're not going to just say you're not studying enough.
Right, right, exactly. I'll get a lot of them that will come and show me their artwork, or just sometimes we'll do a lot of like work together. And when sometimes they tell me, well, you don't understand what it's like. And I can say, oh, I
Yeah.
understand. And that gives me a chance to talk to them. And sometimes the responses are really humorous. I remember when I was in a first grade classroom, I was trying to help out with math. And of course, I didn't get it right. And a little girl said, well, why can't you do this? And I said, oh, I'm just not that great at math. And she said, well, there's grown-up school for that. And I just had to laugh at that because to her, like you said, teachers can do anything, or we're smart, we're like a god. And the truth is everybody has things that they can do and things that they can't.
Yeah.
And it was also really heartwarming when I was in a classroom a few years ago, and I had a kid that was saying, well, why can't you do math? And I said, oh, God just didn't give me that ability to do that.
Mm.
And I had another student that said, me too. And there was that connection that
Yeah.
they're not the only ones that might struggle with something, because we all do have things that we're good at and things that we just might need a little extra help.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and I wanted to go, there was one more
Mhm.
quote of yours that I wanted to share, if it's okay, from another one of your blogs
Okay.
called Finding My Wings with Disability. And
Okay.
I absolutely love this. It's so you say you mentioned in this blog the process of accepting my disabilities has been a journey similar to the changes a butterfly goes through. I will also have others who compare me to others who can fly higher or can go faster. I'm not able to change the actions or words of others. The only thing I can change is myself. Focusing on what I lack and what others can do drags me down further. When I focus on what I can achieve, I find happiness, which enables me to rise to my full potential. And just another beautiful, there's just so many, but this one really jumped out to me because you talk about the process of butterflies, and how they don't start that way,
Mhm.
and every the process for all, from caterpillar to butterfly, you can't rush that process, and everyone is going to be different, and you end up hurting people trying, to rush them through things that they're not supposed to be going at that speed at. And I just thought this was beautiful because it really brings out, just the beauty in the diversity, the beauty in the uniqueness, and the power in it as well. And I just wanted to share that, and make sure that everyone does go to your website and see. I mean, all of your blogs are just so beautifully written. All of your work is so beautifully written. And I just wanted to say thank you for sharing this information, because I think it is. I think anyone who ever, as I was saying before, anyone who ever questions where they belong, this will be very uplifting, and it'll be probably very eye-opening for them as well. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope you continue to write these wonderful blogs. They're just so fantastic.
Thank you so much. Definitely.
So yeah, so with what you're doing now, it sounds like you're quite busy,
Mhm.
with your with Michelle's mission, and also on the website. I didn't mention this, but you did. There's the artwork. It's absolutely beautiful. It just as beautiful as your writing is the artwork that you have available as well. And yeah, so everybody definitely go check that out. Where else would you like people to go to make sure they're not missing all the great work that you're creating for people?
Sure, you can find me, well, primarily at my blog, Michelle's Mission, but you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram. And I also had three stories published in an anthology earlier this spring, that's available for on Amazon, called Rediscovering Your Story.
Great. All right. Well, I'll be sure to share all of that as well.
Okay.
And yeah, before I let you go, one thing that I always have my
Mhm.
guests do, I call it the daily challenge,
Okay.
and it's basically it's not as intimidating as it seems. It's just a question that I like to pose to my guests, asking them what their advice would be to our audience today. And the question that I had that I was hoping you might be able to help answer for our audience is, what would your one word of advice be for anyone with a learning disability, or anyone that wants to advocate for someone they know that has a learning disability? What would you say to them?
I would really encourage them to know what they want and be able to find a way to do that, because there's always a way that they can be able to do it. If one way doesn't work, just keep on trying to do that.
That's wonderful advice. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle, and thanks again for taking the time today. It's been absolutely wonderful having you on the podcast, and I cannot wait to see your blog posts, your new blog post, and your new artwork that you're coming out with. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. I think the world needs to see your work, and they need to hear your voice, and you are impacting people in a great way. And I'm just so happy that you're doing what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Curtis. It's been a pleasure.
Thank Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Manifest Your Greatness podcast. If you liked what we've explored on this episode, then you'll love the Manifest Your Greatness coaching program. The Manifest Your Greatness coaching program is uniquely tailored to help support you on your journey to become the absolute best version of yourself. So if you are committed to taking the steps required to significantly and permanently level up in any area of your life, visit manifestyourgreatness.com/contact. Again, that's manifestyourgreatness.com/contact and schedule your free consultation call today. Talk soon.